Hello, and welcome to today's installment of Decameron in the Time of Coronavirus. My name is Maggie Heeschen, and I'm a third-year PhD candidate in the English department at the University of Minnesota. Today, I'm going to talk about a text that probably all of you are familiar with in some way, and that's The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm not going to dare to tackle the entire text. I'm just going to focus on one chapter from The Two Towers, the second book, called The King of the Golden Hall, and I've paired it with an Old English poem called The Wanderer. More on that in a minute. The reason I chose to talk about The Lord of the Rings is because it's fundamentally a story about hope and good conquering evil. One of the major themes is something that's referred to as the long defeat. That might be familiar to you. If so, feel free to tune out for a minute. The concept of the long defeat is rooted in Christian theology. Tolkien himself was a devout Catholic. But I think that the concept can still be valuable whatever your particular religious beliefs are. Basically, the long defeat is the knowledge that evil will continually rise up in the world, that we'll never be able to fully stop it and achieve a perfect world, but that should not stop us from constantly fighting back against these forces, from striving to do good as long as we're able. In The Lord of the Rings, for example, there is a very small chance that Frodo will succeed in destroying the ring, yet everyone continues to do all that they can in the hope that it will happen and that they will succeed. Now turning to our chapter. If you've read the books or seen the movies, this is when Aragorn, Gandalf, Legolas, and Gimli are traveling to Edoras to meet with King Theoden. I've given you the entire chapter, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on the second and third pages. In this scene, they're walking past the burial mounds for the kings of Rohan before they actually get to Edoras. Here, Gandalf stops and comments on the Cymbalmina, the little white flowers that are on the graves. And he says, "How fair are the bright eyes in the grass! Ever mind, they are called Cymbalmina in this land of men, for they blossom in all the seasons of the year and grow where dead men rest." And here I like to keep in mind that Gandalf is basically an immortal being, whatever you want to call that. Then Aragorn, who's 80 years old, which for his race places him at about being middle-aged, says, "7 mounds upon the left and 9 upon the right. Many long lives of men it is since the Golden Hall was built." Legolas then responds, and keeping in mind, as an elf, he's also basically an immortal creature. And he says, "500 times have the red leaves fallen in Mirkwood in my home since then, and but a little while does that seem to us." So what we have at the beginning of this scene are 3 different reactions to the same visual, to these little white flowers on burial mounds. One from a mortal who seems keenly aware of the mortality of those who are in the mounds, and then 2 from these basically immortal figures, who in a way don't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation in the same way that Aragorn does. Aragorn then goes on to counter Legolas. He says, "But to the riders of the mark it seems so long that the raising of this house is but a memory of song, and the years before are lost in the mist of time. Now they call this land their home, their own, and their speech is sundered from their northern kin." Then Aragorn chants and translates the Lament of the Rohirrim, which is the main reason I wanted to share this chapter. And he says, "Where now the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm and the hauberk and the bright hair flowing? Where is the hand on the harp string and the red fire glowing? They have passed like rain on the mountain, like a wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west behind the hills into shadow. Who shall gather the smoke of the dead wood burning, or behold the flowing years from the sea returning?" In this lament, we see a lot of imagery of the bounty and happiness that have been lost. Images of battle, of singing, the glowing fire, the harvest, but all these things have passed away into the mists of time. In this passage, Tolkien is actually borrowing heavily from the Old English poem The Wanderer, which is an elegiac poem about a man who has lost his lord and his companions in battle and is now alone in the world. The specific lines that he's borrowing are 92 through 96, but I of course would recommend you read the entire poem because it's great. But these lines are, "Where has the horse gone? Where is the rider? Where is the giver of gold? Where are the seats of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? Oh, the bright cup! Oh, the brave warrior! Oh, the glory of princes! How the time passed away, slipped into nightfall, as if it had never been." Now in the rest of the poem, we follow the speaker as he laments his situation and processes his grief, and eventually comes to the conclusion that all worldly things are fleeting, and that the only stability to be found is in God the Father. Again, we have a hint of this idea of the long defeat, that all things eventually decay, that we can never have the perfect world that we long for, but that behind it all is the Christian belief in God. The last piece of the puzzle I want to give you is a little bit about Tolkien himself. He studied English philology and was a professor of Old English at Oxford. But he also fought in the First World War, where many of his friends were killed. And Tolkien himself likely only survived because he contracted trench fever and he was sent back to England to recover. This is an important context for Tolkien as a modern fiction writer. Whereas many modern fiction writers dealt with disillusionment from the world wars by rejecting traditional literary themes and techniques, creating jarring narrative structures or untraditional narratives, Tolkien does the opposite. He turns to the past to find solace, and specifically, he turns to the Old English literature that he so loved, much in the same way that we're now turning to the literature we love to deal with the spread of coronavirus. So I look forward to hearing what you think about these selections. Especially thinking about how does someone use literature to process a grief or to process a concern or a worry. In addition, I think this project will be really interesting because we as academics tend to look at things from our privileged position in the academy where we don't have a personal vested interest in something. We're just saying, well, what did they do with it? But now, because we're living through this situation, we get an interesting opportunity to be able to say, what am I doing right now in this moment? How am I actually dealing with this? Am I reading these stories with the same lens, with the same view? So I think that'll be something that I think is fun for all of us to think of as we work through the Decameron journey. But coming back to what I'm talking about here today, I'd also be curious to hear about your ideas of this concept of the long defeat, which is something that I really love to think about in Tolkien's work. Do you think that the long defeat applies for us in the time of coronavirus or not? Is the act of reading a lament something that's sort of inherently sad? Is it hopeful, depressing? Is it sobering? Is it comforting? Just what does that feel like to you as a reader during this time? Now, I am not trying to say that coronavirus is going to be the end of the world, but I think it's a helpful way to push forward during dark times, to avoid saying, well, things are terrible, so why would we bother? In the last week or so, we've seen a lot of pleas from people in the medical field, from physicians, asking us to practice good social distancing to help flatten the curve so that our hospitals and healthcare providers have a chance to treat people as the disease spreads. But sometimes when we sit around in our houses, we kind of get the feeling, at least I do, that we're not really doing anything worthwhile, that we might as well just lean into this apocalyptic atmosphere, join the massive crowds that were going to bars the weekend before St. Patrick's Day, or the people in those long lines outside of grocery stores and gun shops who are panic buying everything. So for me at least, taking a moment to think about how someone who faced one of the great horrors of the 20th century was able to use this 1,000-year-old Old English elegy to create a lament for a story that's ultimately about hope in the time of overwhelming despair is a good reminder that there is still hope in the world and it's worth fighting for. Thank you.